bit of divergence here. Ekman transport pushes this surface water northward. That surface water, because it's coming from around Antarctica, is very cold. It's saturated in carbon. And as it reaches these warmer subtropical waters, it gets subducted underneath and becomes what is known as Antarctic intermediate water. At this point, it begins its journey around the global ocean. So that's how the Southern Ocean actually soaks up CO2 and puts it into the ocean. Secondly, it's also important because it creates an upwelling. And it takes this deep carbon and nutrient-rich water from the ocean's interior and ventilates it up into the surface ocean and then subsequently the atmosphere. So these are just the two key mechanisms I want you to take away from this. As a result, you get something that looks like this. This is the ocean atmosphere CO2 flux for the Southern Ocean. As you can see, again, close to the Antarctic continent, these red and orange colors indicate that you have an outgassing of CO2 from the ocean. That's the upwelling of those deep waters. And here further north, this is where the intermediate water and actually secondarily biological production puts CO2 into the ocean. And as a result of this, the Southern Ocean actually absorbs up to 50% of all carbon taken up by the ocean each year. It is a massive carbon sink. So just briefly, before I move on to the experiments that I actually ran, I'll just go through quickly why oceanographers love radiocarbon so much. For those of you not familiar with what radiocarbon is or how it works, it's an unstable isotope of carbon that is generated only in the upper atmosphere, has a half-life of roughly 5,730 years, and we can use it to date things up to about 55,000 years old. Now, this is very useful for us because as the radiocarbon dissolves into the surface ocean, say you have a parcel of water that is then subducted into the ocean's interior, no more radiocarbon can get into that parcel of water. And so effectively, if somewhere along its journey through the ocean's interior, we sample that water, we date the amount of radiocarbon that's in that parcel, we're essentially radiocarbon dating that parcel of water. You can see how old it is or how long it has been since that parcel of water was last in contact with the ocean's surface. This is useful because if you have a map of radiocarbon in the ocean's interior, you can see which areas of the ocean are very well ventilated, which are less well ventilated, so you can kind of get an idea where you might see carbon accumulating or where it might be very rapidly flushed through. And finally, I'll be referring to delta carbon-14, and you can just simply think of this as a ratio between carbon-14 and carbon-12. So bringing it back to the deglaciation, and the reason I actually started work in this area was back in 2007, Wally Broker and colleagues published a paper about a period of time during the deglaciation that they coined the mystery interval. Now that occurs between roughly 17,500 and 14,500 years before present, and you can think of it as being bookended by Heinrich Stadial 1 and the Balding Alerod. Now during this period, you see two rather remarkable things. You see atmospheric delta carbon-14 decrease by about 190 per mil, and atmospheric CO2 increase rapidly and synchronously by about 40 parts per million. I just added at the bottom here that Southern Ocean upwelling also increases. It kind of gives a hint of where we want to take this. Now in their paper, they suggested that one plausible theory to explain these signals in the atmospheric records would be if somewhere during the LGM leading up to the Heinrich Stadial 1, that there was a body of water somewhere in the global ocean that had been isolated for a sufficient amount of time that a lot of the radiocarbon had actually decayed away. And that something at the start of the Heinrich event precipitated to ventilate that body of water back into the atmosphere. To test that hypothesis, I used the UVic Earth System Climate Model version 2.9. Now, for those of you not familiar with climate models in general, this is not the kind of GCM you would find in an IPCC report. It's a lot coarser resolution. It's about 1.8 degrees in latitude by 3.6 degrees in longitude. It does not have a dynamic atmosphere. The purpose of the model is to be used for long timescale paleoceanographic purposes. So the atmospheric wind fields are actually monthly averaged reanalysis. So I ran this under Heinrich Event 1 boundary conditions. That includes orbital parameters, ice sheets, CO2, etc. Due to the fact that at the beginning of the Heinrich stadium, you have a collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet into the North Atlantic, we had to simulate that in some way. So we forced the North Atlantic with a 500-year freshwater flux. And then because our model is actually bistable, if you kill deep water formation and overturning in the North Atlantic, it will not restart itself. So we also had to follow that up with a subsequent unphysical saltwater hosing of that same area to get the overturning circulation started again. In conjunction with that, and perhaps most controversially, we shift the winds in the southern hemisphere south by 9 degrees latitude. Now there's a lot of debate whether or not these winds had moved at all. You will see a review paper in 2013, the year after I published this, that would say, okay, maybe the winds were south, north, they could have been where they were today, we really don't know. But we thought, let's just take the most extreme example, and if this doesn't do it, then nothing will. So our two aims are, can we find such a mystery reservoir hiding in the ocean's interior? And then secondly, using this mechanism, can we actually ventilate it? So these are figures from the control simulation. Up here we have the vertically averaged delta carbon-14, and below here we have the dissolved inorganic carbon, and that's vertically integrated through the water column. Now you can see that during this control simulation there is in fact a great deal of carbon accumulated in the North Pacific. And we shouldn't find that too surprising, because both in the present-day ocean and back then, we do not have deep convection in the North Pacific, which means that the waters there are actually quite stagnant, relative to the Atlantic anyway. And that's kind of borne out by this plot here. You can see the delta carbon-14 values are actually far, far lower than, say, in the Southern Ocean and in the North Atlantic, where we actually have overturning. So, plausibly, that could be a mystery reservoir. Now, can we ventilate it? Implementing that freshwater flux that kills the overturning, that starts at the year 17,500, restarting the circulation and shifting the wind south, we get the following profile for atmospheric CO2. And the blue dots show some data from the Dome Sea in Antarctica. I really just want you to take away two things from this plot. First of all, we do not manage to actually ventilate sufficient carbon from the ocean to match the records. But secondly, the rate of change of that, the rate of ventilation is actually quite agreeable with the records. Oh, and I guess I should point out that the simulation where we stopped, restarted, and shifted the wind south is the one that we think best matches the records. And the story is much the same for atmospheric radiocarbon. We do not actually manage to sustain this ventilation long enough to achieve the full signal you find in the records. Now to follow up on this, I was a lot more interested in whether or not we had actually found the correct location for this mystery reservoir. Is it possible that the carbon in the North Pacific had been there long enough to account for this change in atmospheric CO2? So this plot just simply marks locations of a lot of ocean sediment cores that I collected. And then I took the grid cells from the equivalent places in the model and compared the radiocarbon values. Again, if we just focus on the red solid line, I think it does pretty well. It's in the right ballpark. So it's not too far, especially at the start of the simulation, it's not too far outside what we see in the paleo records. These three do less well, you can see down here, but that doesn't surprise me that much because they are actually on the margin of where we see the bulk of this carbon. And it's perhaps, you could say that accurate values there would be highly dependent on how the model actually ventilates this carbon, so the ventilation pathway of that water. So just to summarize this first part, we believe that it's actually quite plausible that such a mystery reservoir may have existed in the North Pacific. In our experiments, a perturbation of both the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation and the southern hemisphere westerlies can ventilate some of this carbon. The rate is comparable with the proxy data, but we can only sustain that rate for about half the period that is covered in the instrumental records. Now, that summarizes the first part of this project, but that left me quite unsatisfied. I was actually more curious to see that whether or not these changes we saw were more due to the forcing of the overturning circulation or the winds themselves. So for the large part of my PhD, I endeavored to undertake a more detailed sensitivity study that said, if all else being equal, if we change the winds, what happens? And more importantly, how does it change? And by doing that, I dug into how the circulation changes, how it affects the individual carbon pumps, which is what I will discuss now. So I use the same model again. I integrate these under pre-industrial boundary conditions this time. In addition to an inert dye tracer, which I've included in the model, and this essentially just puts in the surface ocean a dye tracer at each of these locations, which I've named. And the aim there is to see if we change the winds, is there more water from the Atlantic Ocean in the simulations now? Is there more water from the Antarctic? Do we get any sort of change in Pacific water formation? And this can give us clues as to why the distribution of carbon is changing the ocean and why either the atmosphere has less or more carbon. And secondly, I introduced two new dissolved inorganic carbon tracers into the model, which I will explain later when we get there. So the simulations involved changing the wind stress by both their latitudinal position and their intensity. I shift these wind stress profiles by 1.8, 3.6, or 5.4 degrees, and I combine that with a change in intensity of plus or minus 20%. And these are actually pretty reasonable values. And just in that panel A there at the bottom, you can see just a combination of every perturbation that I ran. Now, this is the first results plot. It's nice and linear, almost suspiciously so, I would say. You can see the change in DIC is plotted on the x-axis. This is all relative to the control simulation. And change in atmospheric carbon is plotted on the y-axis. I'm not going to go into every simulation because that would take all day, but what I want you to take away from this is that these simulations here, each of these with a green dot, they were where we shifted the winds north and then had some combination of a change in intensity or not. Whereas all these simulations shifted the wind south. And that seems to be the first order control over the exchange in carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean. I'll just add this orange plus and this orange asterisk represent simulations where we either increased or decreased the intensity, but there was no shift. I won't really talk about these for the rest of the talk because, as I said, the first order effect was the direction of the shift. And also these are outliers, but these represent simulations where the shift was small enough that actual change in intensity either balanced it out or actually overpowered them, in case you're wondering. Now, those among you may have, some of you may have noticed that this is not following a one-to-one line, and I'll just briefly note that that is what that would look like. And this is because when we put carbon into the atmosphere, it is buffered by the land surface. So this model does include a land surface model, including organic carbon in trees, plants, and soil carbon. So when we have a large ventilation of carbon into the atmosphere, a lot of that is taken up by the land surface. It doesn't all end up in the atmosphere. And vice versa, if you take a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, it is balanced by the fact that a lot of land surface carbon will go into the atmosphere to compensate that. So there's a buffering effect is what I'm saying. Okay, now back into the ocean. I think this is one of the most interesting results from the study, in the sense that if you shift the winds north, there is like this kind of bipolar effect in terms of the carbon budgets of the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. If you shift the winds north, you're taking a lot of carbon out of the Pacific. Some of it's going into the Atlantic, some of it's going into the Indian Ocean, and you're also ventilating the Southern Ocean here. And of course, it's really hard to see here because this is a very subtle shade of blue, but if you shift the wind south, carbon accumulates in the Pacific and it is taken out of the Atlantic, broadly speaking. Now you would think that with that nice linear graph I showed you before and this quite simple relationship, that the relationship with ocean circulation would be quite simple. You would be wrong. Unfortunately, in every single one of our simulations, and I have plotted here on the x-axis the percentage of all traces in the global ocean, so that's like a saturation of those traces. And remember, this is a proxy for ocean ventilation. So in every single one of our simulations where we shift the winds, the ocean becomes more ventilated, which is kind of counterintuitive. If you have a more ventilated ocean, you might expect that all of those simulations should then show greater atmospheric CO2. It's not the case. This in turn is driven by the fact that in every single simulation, we see an increase in water sourced from the Antarctic region. So that includes both Antarctic bottom water and Antarctic intermediate water. And conversely, if you believe in the sort of bipolar hypothesis of the overturning circulation of the ocean, that means that you see a decrease in water created in the North Atlantic. Now this is a problem. We had no idea what was going on here. And this leads to how we broke down the carbon pumps in the ocean to try and figure out exactly what was going on. For those of you who are unaware, the physical pump or the solubility pump is dependent on temperature, salinity, alkalinity. It involves the dissolution of CO2 into the surface ocean, and then large-scale circulation, so advection, convection, brings this carbon into the ocean's interior. It's a very physical process. I've named that preformed DIC, and that's what that tracer means when I refer to it later. The biological pump, on the other hand, consists of the soft tissue and carbonate pumps. That's when CO2 that is in the surface ocean is used in the process of photosynthesis. It's biologically fixed. These critters later die, and their biological carbon rains into the ocean's interior as detritus and later remineralizes back into DIC. I'm calling that remineralized DIC. That's what I refer to later in the figures. So, here we have changes in preformed carbon and remineralized carbon for all simulations, again, relative to the control. Excuse me. One thing to note is that preformed carbon always increases, remineralized carbon always decreases. This should make intuitive sense. If we have increased ventilation of the global ocean, that means we are pumping more carbon into the ocean. Yeah? And that also means that the remineralized carbon has less time to accumulate, so it actually should always decrease. Now, what determines whether or not there's a net increase or decrease in carbon in the ocean is actually determined by which side of this one-to-one line that these simulations fall on. And I think it should be clear to see that most of the northward shifted simulations fall below the line, and most of the southward shifted simulations fall above the line. Which means in the simulations where we shift the winds north, the biological pump is winning, if you want to put it like that. And in the simulations where we shift the winds south, the physical pump is winning. So you're putting more carbon in than you're taking out in remineralized carbon. I hope I haven't lost anyone here. Try and go a bit quickly. Breaking that down even further, I've decided to plot this for each individual ocean basin to see what is actually dominating that signal. And you can see, again, it's not quite clear here, but these two blobs here, it's two blobs, not one, represent the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. You know, at most, they're only ever exchanging about 200 petagrams of carbon, whereas the signal in these simulations is hugely dominated by what happens in the Pacific Ocean. So the Pacific Ocean seems to be the key player in determining whether or not the ocean loses carbon or gains it. But that still doesn't explain how, when we have a complete increase in Antarctic bottom water, Antarctic intermediate water, which we think in the present day are the key drivers of ocean circulation and ventilation, if this one's constantly increasing, how can this be true? And that's why we get down here. This is the change in the Pacific tracer in the global ocean. Now, initially, we completely dismissed this, because you can see compared to the Antarctic tracer, this changes by up to 20% in these simulations, whereas this changes by an order of 1.5%, well, 1%. But it's also the one that actually fits best with the data. And what I subsequently discovered is that it's actually the very small change in Pacific overturning. So if you shift the winds north, you actually create a very, very weak intermediate overturning cell in the North Pacific. And it is very small, but it's just enough to ventilate that very carbon-saturated North Pacific carbon pool. And that seems to be what's making the difference. And the opposite is true for the southward shift. You actually weaken that cell, and you allow more remineralized carbon to accumulate there. And that's kind of what I'm trying to show here. This is a bit of a tricky plot, but what I'm showing in these left two plots is I've integrated over all cells where changes in the physical pump outweigh changes in the biological pump. So that means you're pumping more carbon into the ocean via physical processes than you're taking out via biological processes. And you can see when you shift the winds north, yeah, great. It's intensified here, we'd expect that. That's the increased Antarctic sourced water. Same in the North Atlantic, but there's nothing in the Pacific. And you can see if you move over to the biological pump, this is what's going on. That is where the biological pump is actually outweighing changes in the physical pump. And all of that carbon, and you can see it here on a depth latitude profile, all that carbon in the shallow to intermediate North Pacific, that is what's being ventilated. And that is the key difference between these simulations. So, in summary, if you increase the intensity or shift the winds northward, you can increase in atmospheric CO2. And the opposite is true for a decrease in intensity and a southward shift of the winds. The physical and the biological pumps always oppose each other, and this is due to the fact that we have that massive increase in Antarctic sourced water for all these simulations. Again, for the northward shifts, the biological pump wins. For the southward shifts, the physical pump wins. And the changes, these small changes in the North Pacific circulation are key. Thank you. Yeah.
Very interesting. So back to those centennial changes that they now see in the ice core record. So you think this is being driven by the mechanism of the changes in the wind field?
It's plausible. Like I said, a paper was published the year after I published that first paper on the history of tool. And they said, look, we have absolutely no confidence in terms of what the winds were doing during that period. And unlike in my simulations, it's not the only thing that's going on at that time. So subsequent papers have come out discussing the possibility that it had nothing to do with the ocean in the first place, and that you could get falling permafrost actually adding this carbon to the atmosphere. You don't need the ocean mechanism. So I think there's still a lot of questions around this period. But this is definitely plausible, I think. It would just be useful to do it again with a few different models, maybe tweak the method a bit, just something that's more robust, so you get the same result with several different attempts. Yep.
So what ultimately drives these shifts in the wind field? To what extent is that understood?
So a good example is the fact that over the past 30 years, the winds have actually been intensifying and shifting south. And this is in part due to anthropogenic warming. So if you increase the temperature gradient between the polar atmosphere and the subtropical atmosphere, that temperature gradient becomes bigger, and this wind field, I won't get into too much detail, but it's actually driven by how steep that gradient is. And these eddies that break in the atmosphere to try and balance that gradient, they drive the wind. So if you steepen that gradient, then you also increase the intensity of the winds. So yeah, that's one way you can do it. You can just increase that cross-latitude temperature gradient. Another way is perhaps changes in sea ice extent. Another way is if you shut down overturning in the North Atlantic, if that latitudinal heat transport gets shut down, then that heat has to go somewhere else. You might find that then with an intensification of Southern Ocean overturning, you get more heat transport south rather than north. And that can change the position and intensity of the winds as well. You're right in saying that what I've done is cheating a bit, because these winds never actually change for no reason. They never change in isolation. And that's important to remember, because if you shift the winds, then you have to assume that something else is happening in the background as well, which it was in glaciation. I hope that makes sense.
I think we better wrap this up now because we have a booking for lunch and we're already a bit late for it. So, so thanks again for a great talk.